Hello, everybody, and welcome to Writing Elegant Text. My name is Franklin Weber, and I am a training lead here at Chef. I'm excited to have you here, so let's get started. All right, as I mentioned, I'm a training lead here at Chef. You're welcome to reach out to me at any one of these various social professional networks and get in contact with me if there's any questions or any feedback you'd like to give me personally after this presentation. I have a few more housekeeping items to cover just to make sure before we get started. So let's go through all those before we get into the actual content. So I promise you in about 5 minutes we'll get started with that. So it's important for me to illustrate who I think you are when I was putting together this content, thinking about what kind of skills that you have. And my general assumption about you, the viewer right now participating in this content, is that you're an author or maintainer of Chef cookbooks. So you've got several cookbooks within your organization, and every one of those cookbooks has, a test suite associated with it, a number of cookbooks available to you. Those cookbooks available to you, you're managing them every day, and perhaps the managing of those tests are becoming more tiresome, more work than what you originally intended, because they're sort of growing in scope. That coverage that you were hoping for, that 100%, is now perhaps biting you a little bit as you tend to come back to these cookbooks and try to make changes to them. So again, you're a cookbook maintainer, you've done some testing and you're working on tests, and you might also just be someone that's interested in learning a little bit more about Ruby's RSpec. And what that really means in terms of perhaps what, if this is something that's not you and this is someone you'd like to be. But down below here, I show off, there's 2 webinars that I did before about doing testing with your cookbooks. You can take a look at those webinars, or you can sign up for some of our training, or perhaps you participated in the training, our Chef Essentials and our test-driven cookbook development training. So either one of those courses or pass through the code or pass through sort of the learning journey will get you ready and started and prepared for it. All right. I think my screen might have disappeared for a second. Let me just pause for a moment to see what's happened. It seems like it has skipped out. All right. Oh, there we go. Everything is back. All right. So let me tell you, now that I tell you who I think you are, I want to tell you about what you are going to learn today. So we're going to look at some tests. Particularly, we're going to look at the tests in one cookbook that is making a lot of assumptions about the operating system that it's being installed on. So there's a lot of packages that need to be installed, node attributes that need to be set, and even a lot of setup spent in defining the platforms themselves, right? So there's a lot of duplication within this cookbook that's being defined that's taking care of a lot of things for us. Now, what we want to do is create a create a specification file that looks a little more like this, where we've made more succinct expressions of how we're asserting what the attributes are, how we specify our packages to be installed more clearly stated, and of course our platform information is also cleaned up so that it's more clearly expressed. And eventually, all those things are going to be extracted into a Ruby gem so that when we want to take this code that we've created, all these helpers and all these things that we've defined inside of this cookbook, we can easily remove it from this cookbook and now bring it to multiple cookbooks. So it's available to use with all of our cookbooks within our organization. All right, so let's get started. This is the schedule of events for today. We're going to be doing this introduction, just these housekeeping items. We've got some techniques that I'm going to show you, about 7 concepts in the 40 minutes that we have. And then I'm going to pause at the end for some questions, and then, of course, some wrap-up, just talk about links and other resources. So that's important to talk about in terms of the technique. What does that mean? Well, I'm going to be using a real live repo to be doing the work here to show some of the examples of the things that I'm creating. And in that, I'm going to be going through this, editing in my editor. You're welcome to do the same thing. You're welcome to go to the Chef Training Elegant Text repo and download this content or clone this content, and you can follow along with me. And of course, if you're watching this after the fact, I still encourage you to follow along with me, pause the video as you continue to move through it. I think it'll be a great way to sort of learn these 7 techniques that I'm going to show you. All right. Now, and the other important thing is, if you're watching this live, you can ask a question. So I encourage you to ask a question during the course of this presentation. Anytime any thought comes to you during this process, please just ask me a question. There should be just a little button or a little tab down at the bottom of your screen below the presentation. Just click on that and you can send me a question and I'll answer it during our time that we have here. You're also welcome to leave a comment. There's a Rate This tab. There's a good spot right there to sort of give a rating, and also just leave a comment if you're interested in seeing more of these presentations, if you'd like to give feedback to me and my presentation style, or any of the content that we deliver here through our webinar system, you know, those kind of things. These skill building ones are some of the ones that I like to deliver. If there's more that you would like to see, please let me know, and I'd love to get those for you, and get those presented for you. And then finally, we encourage you to share today's webinar with your professional and social networks. And you can find those little buttons, you know, those little social chiclets on the details tab down on the bottom there as well. Just click on that, find the little social network that works for you, and then send those off. All right. So without further ado, thank you for joining today's session, Writing Elegant Tests. I'm Franklin Weber, and let's get started. All right, so as I mentioned, we have about 7 techniques that we're supposed to go through today, and we're going to work through them and then leave some time for questions as we move through it. These are the 7 techniques. We're going to be returning back to this agenda screen throughout the day to just kind of make sure our progress is being charted. So let's just get started with the first one right here. And here we go. The first rule of presentations are don't use the latest version of PowerPoint. Should have realized that. Hold on one second as I fix my screen. Something that I forgot to do for myself. All right, I'm going to reopen the presentation. I knew it was going to happen. It's going to crash in just a moment. And there's something about PowerPoint on Mac that just doesn't love me. Here we go. All right, back to where we were. Okay, there we are. Okay, so let's talk about let. This is probably the most important helper that I'm going to be showing you today. And this one is something that you're probably already familiar with and you've seen within the cookbook test that you have written. What's powerful about let is its ability to be a helper for you to express additional state or information that describes the test that you're going to use. We call them memoized helpers in RSpec. And the memoized helper part is really trying to describe the idea of how it sort of stores this data and it's able to be reused. So it's something a little bit different than, say, just a method or an invocation or simply a variable. It does a little bit more. But if you're not already familiar with let me kind of diagram it out for you. So you see number 1 there, that's the let being used within the code. When you define a let, you specify a Ruby symbol that is the thing that you're going to use within your example. So you see number 4 there is that invocation. That's us tied to the Ruby symbol. And then here, when you define a let on number 3, you define a block. You define a block that describes what you want that thing to build, to be. So in this case, we're defining in chef spec a fake runner, essentially a solo run through our code. And then we're storing that as the chef run object. By memoization, what we mean is that the first time when chef run calls or essentially gets sending the message, we invoke that block. So the contents of that block are invoked. That's the step number 2 there. And then off screen somewhere, you know, somewhere in the bowels of RSpec, the contents of that block is stored, so that later it can be retrieved when we say use it again in the same example. So on number 4 there, we're using the chef run again, and RSpec is going to retrieve that stored execution. Now, this is where it's a little bit different. When you use it in the first case, number 1, it's going to load and store it. When you use it the second case there, the chef run in that same example, it's going to use that stored invocation. What's important to note is that on step 3, it's going to load and store it again. So each example is a completely new and different memoized, essentially, helper. And this is important to ensure that our tests run cleanly. So it's something to be aware of, that when you use them in the same example, you're using the same exact run. And that can help in terms of like speed and efficiency if you want to use the same run. And just be aware of sort of performance cost that comes with using your chef run in multiple sort of examples. All right, you've seen this, like I said. You've seen this in some of the examples that you've already been using. When you generate an initial test file, this is what you get: a let chef run have this runner set up to be whatever it is, with whatever particular platform information. But we are going to use let to do some things like that to help express our tests. So let's go into a demonstration to use let to test our express our tests succinctly. All right, so let's go there. So here we have the test file. I've got the test file open within the example project I provided. This is the same one that you've seen in the little videos at the beginning. And first and foremost, I want to focus on particularly where I can use the let for the most efficiency to help describe things. So you see here, this example is installing all the necessary packages on this platform. So on CentOS 6.7, all of these packages must be installed. And I'm going to spend a little time here just cleaning this up. So I'm going to create a local variable called installed packages. And I'm going to create an array that contains all the name of those essentially packages. This is a quick way to create a white space delimited array. It saves me from doing quotes and commas. I can just really write out all the names of these packages listed down below. Now here's the cool part is that I start out with this example that I'm going to type out, and watch me. If you see any problems, just give me a yell. Oops, already I'm creating problems for myself. There, that looks right, so I've created that. Now I'm going to take this array and I'm going to iterate over the array. So every array has an each method. This is the same as like a for loop in other programming languages. And I'm going to call essentially each item in the array name when we get inside of this loop. And then what I'm going to do is copy this expectation syntax, and I'll say, I expect the chef run to install the package with this name. All right, so that is an equivalent of what we wrote here, now being expressed up above in this more simple syntax. We might be asking, well, that's not exactly a let, but let's start here as far as the starting point. I'm going to run my test. I'm going to run chef exec rspec. Spec, this is in the unit directory, inside of the recipes directory, and then this is the default spec. So I'm going to run this test and see the results of this. So I've made a small change. I just want to make sure that I haven't broke anything before I take my next step in terms of refactoring. All right, I got a warning or two, but that's fine. I've got my 40 examples and 0 failures, so I feel pretty confident to take my next step, which is to create a let. Right, so if I was to leave this example in this test here, you'll note that it's not very clear what exactly I'm doing, at least to me. This install package is definitely a variable that I like that expresses the state of all the packages that I need on my system. But I think what would be nice is if I can use a let in a similar way to describe this outside of the example. So I can say, you know what, here's the installed packages on the system, and I'm just going to take this array and move it into the let. And I'm going to delete this local variable. The beauty of Ruby is that it has a very similar past as Perl, and Perl and Ruby both have this thing called bare words. And bare words mean like, is it a local variable or is it a method? We don't know. And so a lot of times that can be confusing, and then a lot of times it can be really nice once you become used to it. So in this case, when we write install packages here, it's going to now refer to the let helper that's been created for us. So I'm going to rerun our test in the background. Nothing should change here. Our test should pass. I'm taking nice little baby steps as I move through this refactoring. And we'll see that I've got, again, 40 examples, 0 failures, and I feel pretty confident about what I'm building. So you'll see, this is a start, right? This is nice because I can say, well, a chef run is this. This is a list of all the installed packages. This is very easy for me to come in and edit at any point later if I needed to. Here, you'll notice it says installed packages, so this example is pretty generic now. And if we look at this, I'm going to copy this example because, you know what, this is very common to what we see down below here in this example. So again, this is one of those moments where I can reuse some of this code that I built. The thing is, I need to create a new let. So I'm going to create a let here that's called installed packages. And in this installed packages, I'm going to prefer just the do end notation for a block. And I'm going to say, again, let's make a white space delimited array. I'll do libtool, autoconf, unzip, rsync, make gcc, autogen, and we got shtool and pkg config. So again, I'm using that same concept to express the same test here. I'll just do a little reorganizing, moving that install packages up, and then my example here. And I'm going to execute this again, and hopefully this all will work for me. But while that's running in the background, I want to focus on another thing that I think let is really powerful at doing. In the same way that I extracted those packages outside of the examples, you can also use them to extract tiny details about, say, your platform and your other thing, other information about what's going on. In this case, for me, as a left to right reader, so predominantly I'm writing and reading in English, and I tend to read from left to right, top to bottom. This is the platform information is really important, but yet it's hidden essentially to the rightmost part of this sort of context, or this sort of this little let helper. What I'd rather do is describe something I'll call node attributes, and then again use another let helper here to describe that. I'm going to prefer, again, the do and end notation for blocks. And I'm going to define this hash of content here. And I can do the same thing in the code that I did down below. The nice part is I can copy this example here. I can take this down below here. And then I can say, well, let's let the node attributes, right? And I'm going to say, let the node attributes be this. And I'm going to extract this information here. So these are the 3 node attributes that this platform requires. And now I can delete this. Now, if you notice, I copied this one from up above, this let right here. This is the same as the let that we have described up here. It's the same chef run, the same node attributes. And when that's the case, we can actually rely on a parent context to essentially give us the let. So I'm going to remove it from here. And what happens is essentially this chef run is available here without me having to write it in multiple locations because it's in a parent context that surrounds it all. I'm going to rerun our test. And this is one of those first big moments where if you can start to use your lets to clean up your code, to express the things that are different from those things that are the same, you can start to find those similar things and start to extract those so you don't have to repeat yourself as much. And we'll see here my tests are passing. So that's us using let, right, to express our test more succinctly. Let's go through a review of this. If you'd like to see an actual example of this, on your screen in text that you can copy and paste, you're welcome to copy down this link right here. It'll take you to a repo where this is being worked on. All right. So we use let for clarity. Let is a great way to allow us to express, like I said, the state of our system, additional variables, details about our system, different things that we want to extract and sort of declare more clearly when we're working with it. So we had this initial one with the chef run with the platform information. We extracted it with the node attributes. And because of that, we were able to move that chef run to the parent context, which gave us the ability to remove it. And if we were to continue to refactor the file, we could remove it from every one of those subcontexts and just keep one at the top of the file, essentially gaining us probably about 20, 40 lines of code, depending on how big those chef run objects happen to be, or those chef run helpers happen to be. So that's us using let. Let is giving us a lot of power, and it's one of my favorites. Well, let's go into the next one, which is called shared examples, because we were left with a state inside of our test that I think really brings up a point where what happens when we start defining examples that look similar to each other in different contexts. If I was to show you this in the code, shared examples allows us to, and let me move over to the code here, it looks something like this, right? We had this. Installed packages were different, the let, but in this case, what was the same was the examples we wrote. It installs the necessary packages, right? Installed packages each do, expect the chef run. Both of these are the same, but the lets are different. Well, we might have that more often expressed across a lot of our recipes or even across a lot of our cookbooks. The same looking example over and over again. So what I want to do is show you a way that you can create a way to share those examples. Take those examples, extract them, and then almost create like a little stamp that you can reuse in multiple locations. So we're going to use them to express the similarities. So I'm going to return back to my editor. I'm going to bring us back to the top here, and then here's that installs necessary packages, right? And so here's this installs necessary packages. I'm going to do this thing called shared examples. So this is an RSpec. It's called shared examples. You give it a name. In this case, we'll call installs packages, and you give it a block. And inside that block, you place all the examples that you want to have, that you want to share. And I'm going to take this shared examples, And I'm going to extract it and move it up above into the parent context. That doesn't insert it into the parent context. This is sort of its own sort of entity, its own sort of block or sort of context, its own sort of like unit. And now, like I said, a stamp. Now, to actually use the stamp, I need to say something like this. It behaves like, and then I use the name of that shared example group, and I apply it here. So exactly like that, I've now extracted my examples into this stamp that I can reuse in multiple occasions as long as I stamp this context, essentially, inside of here with that, essentially, that statement. It behaves like installed packages. So let me rerun my test here to make sure that everything is passing correctly. And if that looks good, I feel confident making my next change, which is to refactor the other moment where I'm doing the same thing. So it installs the necessary packages. I can now replace it with it behaves like installs packages and rerun the test here as well. So I'll run the test. But again, this is all I did was I took these things, move this into this sort of shared example set, and now I'm applying the shared example inside of here. You know, I could do the same thing here as well. I could essentially place this inside of here, and I could say let the installed packages be this, and now define the installed packages for this environment and continue on with that. I'm going to save that for another time, but that's work that you could do inside of the example repo that I provided for you. All right. So you can do more than just that installed example one, but we use that as our example here. Let's just review. Again, here is a link to a repository that you can look at, and you can touch the source code if you're interested. So that will give you the example repository that I'm working with as well. So shared examples let you describe behavior. It says here of classes and modules. The reason why it says that is because we're usually, when we're reading our spec documentation, our spec authors are thinking about, you know, Ruby classes and modules, and not essentially our tests about our recipes and things like that. What we're doing when we're describing that behavior is, of course, extracting those expectations about a chef client run, and we're able to essentially realize them in a particular example group whenever we want them to be. This is a link to the documentation if you want to look a little bit more about shared examples. Here again, what you want to do is use your let as your first step to isolate the things that are different. Then you will have a bunch of examples that look the same. And when you have those examples that look the same, then you want to decide, does it make sense for me to extract those examples into a shared examples block, right? And that's what we did here. We extracted the example, the shared example, across these two different contexts, and we placed them into this block here. And it works really well in terms of like us allowing us simply to just say, it behaves like it installs packages. As long as we have these let statements within each one of these contexts, we'll be totally fine. Everything will work great for us. All right, so that's technique number 2. We've got a few more to go, and we've got plenty of time to do it. Remember, you're welcome to ask questions throughout. I'll get to them at the end, or perhaps my peripheral vision is able to catch them in the chat window. Then I'll grab them, but like I'll just sort of move on forward. But remember, ask your questions as they come to you. All right, so now we need to talk about defining a method. We are using Ruby. Remember, the power of us using Chef is the fact that it's built on Ruby, and it's not just built on Ruby and obfuscating or hiding Ruby underneath the covers. We are actually writing Ruby code. And we sometimes might forget this, or we maybe want to actively forget this, but the idea is that because we're writing Ruby code, we have the ability to use all the power that Ruby provides to us. And one of those is something that you should never forget, which is the ability to define methods within, say, your recipes, or in this case, even your examples for your specifications. So we can define a Ruby method to take care of some tedious work of retrieving node attributes. This is something that we'll see in our example here. So this is how you define a method. You say def space the name of the method. In this case, the method name is file. It takes a single parameter called name. And then within the method, we define some content. So between the def and the end, we have a contents of the method. And what's important to know about Ruby methods is that the last line automatically returns a value. So it's what we call the implicit return. Where most languages you might be familiar with, you have an explicit return. You have to say return and then the value you want to return. That's available inside of Ruby, but A lot of times we just rely on the fact that the last line is returning a value for us, and that gives us a lot of power in terms of just expressiveness. So this method name file is a single parameter file name. We're going to use that method inside our essentially work here to make make it easier for us to extract node attributes. Oops. All right. So here we are. We're back in our example here. I am now inside of this, and I want to look at the node attributes part, because that's the part that I think is the next sort of eyesore in terms of our test that we're working on. We'll see here, we ask the chef-run object for the node object. Then we grab from that node object our node attributes that are defined within the cookbook. And again, we do the same thing inside of this one as well, right? We do the same thing repeatedly over and over again. Now, this is a moment where we can't use a let. A let doesn't work very well in this moment because we have something that changes every single time. The let part really doesn't allow us to sort of pass a parameter into it. When you define a let, it's simply the value that you store into it. You don't get to pass a parameter. But that's where a method is really powerful. A method allows us to pass a parameter, and thus we're able to pass a parameter, something like one of these values right here, and then we can retrieve whatever value we need. So let's start out with what we can use a let for. I'm going to use let to describe the node object, and I'm going to say it's the chef-run.node. So this is a quick refactor that I could do to essentially just remove this from all my code examples. And that seems pretty, clear, right? Within this expectation, or this example, excuse me, right before my expectation, I am asking the node object to retrieve the value. That kind of thing. Does a good job of sort of cleaning up, but this is the point, again, where we run into some trouble. And this is where we can define a method. So this is where I'm going to say, let's define a method called attribute. We might want to call it cookbook attribute or CK attribute, whatever you want to do in terms of your naming conventions that works. We give a name of the attribute that we want to provide. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to extract this right here. And instead of literally being Apache mirror, we're going to say, whatever name you provide for us. So now what you'll notice is that it says attribute name like this. So I've changed it so that the functionality is different. So what I do is I say attribute name like that. And now this method invocation is going to call this right here. It's going to pass Apache mirror in. Here's the way to think about it. Apache mirror gets passed in. That becomes this. And then really we have the same sort of translation. It translates out to that same thing that we were writing before, but now is dynamic enough that we can use it very quickly and easily within our expectations, allowing us to write something like this, right? So now I can go very quickly, move through, define an attribute like this, and define it like that, right? I can quickly do this for a lot of them. Another option is just grab the prefix bin here, delete this, and then put this in right there, right? So now this is much clearer. This one line order command that tells me I expect the attribute Apache mirror to equal this. I feel like it reads better as well. And this helper right here is really powerful. It's one of those things where you go, yeah, this is a really cool thing that I could use. And one of those things where you're like, yeah, let's move this to the top so that other people can use it. More of the context can use this. And we got to start thinking about how we can perhaps use this in more locations as well, because this is stuff that, you probably want to use across multiple different cookbooks. Perhaps if you change the name of the cookbook here and all that stuff, but we'll get into that. All right. So Ruby methods are powerful because they allow us to do this kind of work, allows us to take something a little bit further than like a let. A let is just sort of a static value, but the function or the method here allows us sort of insert a value and kind of programmatically do the work that we need to do. Here's an example link to the code you can take a look at. That's a lowercase L there, just to be clear. So you can take a look at the actual code, copy and paste, and how to see this in action. So we created a helper method. Again, helper methods are available to us. Methods, essentially, that do any kind of work are helpful. And so this helper method saving us the time of doing the retrieval of node attributes, which I think was powerful. This is what that method looked like. Remember, def keyword and the name of the method and the parameters there, and then the contents of it. Here's the code that we had. We had this code. It says it Apache mirror, it prefix root. We had a lot of setup where it was doing a lot of chef-run.node, right, to pull out that information about our node attributes. And we replaced it first with this, which was the node let, which essentially gives us a little bit of cleanup. But then what's even better is when we define this attribute method, and this attribute method is the way to sort of step that up to make that work in a nice way. You'll notice here in this example that I'm providing, this is a helper that's provided to you by ChefSpec. ChefSpec automatically grabs the name of the cookbook and gives it to you as describe cookbook. It grabs it from essentially the describe up top. If you look at right here, if I go to the top of this, the describe, the cookbook here is what's being grabbed by that name right there. So that's how it grabs that information. So you don't actually have to hard code it with the ARC cookbook name or whatever cookbook you're working with. If you use this, it makes it more portable as well. So, all right. So that's what we did there. And that's us using a helper method to really clean up some of our, essentially, some of our tests. So let's talk about shared context. All right. So shared context is very similar to shared examples. It allows us to find a block, and that will be executed in a particular example group that we want. The power of a shared context is the fact that it is able to do more than a shared example. So if you think about it, shared examples allows us to grab just an example. A shared context allows us to grab more than that. It allows us to grab let helpers, helper methods, and examples and put them together. To define a shared context, you create a shared context here, and we'll say a converged, we'll call it a converged node, or recipe actually is probably it. A converged recipe. You know, I'll say all the things on a converged recipe, yep, it's got to have a node. Yep, we want this attributes helper. Yep, we want this as well. And you know what? I even want to grab something more than that. I want to grab this right here. I want to grab that chef run object right there. And I'm going to put this inside of here. And this is something I definitely would want to save and probably share with other things. So right now, I'm just going to extract this and put this up top. And then I'm going to include this, essentially import, include, you know, bring this into here by saying, in this case, just specifying the context I want to bring in. And all you have to say is include the context of converged recipe. So this is just taking our helpers, extracting it in this thing that's now portable for more of our specs, and then I'm able to reference or load it inside of here. So let me rerun our test to make sure everything is looking good. And that looks fine. All right, everything is looking fine there. We've got this right there. So this context is now sitting outside of this describe block. The important part, it has to be before the context. If you specify it like this, well, an arrow will be generated. So it's important that it's at least before this. It's also not really a great idea that it's here at the beginning of the file, but we'll address that in all due time. So again, here's an example of me using this. It's the same link, I believe, as you saw before. If you want to take a look at that source code, go ahead. All right, so shared context is a little bit more. It allows you to take more than just examples. It allows you to take let helpers, helper methods, examples if you needed them. You know, all those things that might be useful that you can pass between different, essentially your spec files that you might need. Right? We have this context, the chef run, the let, our def attributes. We extracted them, placed them inside of here, and then move them up above, and then place this include context. So that now we can say, yep, it's a converged recipe, which means it's got a node, of course, it's got attributes, it's of course got a chef run, it's got all these things taken care of for us. And so that's us using shared context to make things a lot better. So what I'd like to talk about now is this thing, a technique called require. Now require is the Ruby method require, which you've seen before. Require loads a given file name, and it returns true if that's successful or false if it's not, right, or whether it's already loaded or not. If that file doesn't exist, of course, it blows up. It's already existing inside of Ruby. You've got power of this. And you're already using it if you look at the example. So let's use require to organize our thoughts, and I'll explain it a little bit more as we use it. So what's important to note is that you'll see here at the top of the file, we've got this require spec helper. This require spec helper is loading for us this spec helper file that's right there. And it loads it based on a file path. So it's very similar to what you would think of in your operating system. You have a path in which commands are executed. Ruby maintains a load path. And that load path really just stores what path does it look for these files in. And when you run chef exec rspec, and I'm going to uncomment this thing out, I'm going to show you what the load path looks like. It's pretty long. It's a pretty huge sort of load path. So here are all the directories that it looks in. And it says, hey, when you say require spec helper, do I find it under lib/spec helper? No. Do I find it under arc/spec/spec helper? Yes, I do. So really when you say require, it's looking at this load path and trying to find that file, that particular file that you're interested in finding. And we'll see that that's what's going on here. So this spec helper file is loaded first, and this is a good spot for us to take certain things like this, the shared context out. We can take that and move that into our essentially spec helper file. We can take our shared examples if we want to use them across different spec files, and we can place them here as well. I'm going to do a little cleanup and move them into place, and this is it, right? We can now take that over there and essentially have a cleaner specification file by moving more of it into our shared file, essentially a spec helper. As long as that file is loaded first, which it should be, we'll see everything pass, and essentially require is just doing a little bit of nice cleanup for us. So we'll see this nice require spec helper. We now know that, of course, we have to go to multiple locations to figure this context information out, but hopefully it makes it clear when we read this. All right, so that's require. That's a little bit of just sort of demonstration of how it works and a little explanation about where it's all coming from. Again, that's that same link that I showed you before. You can take a look at the source code and play with it. Here, require, again, loads the file. It tries to place that or search for it on the load path unless you give it an absolute path. We've got our spec helper, which sort of takes care of a lot of that stuff in the spec helper file. I uncommented the load path to kind of show you what that looks like. There's an example of it, you know, in some way. And so that's what we see. Require is very powerful in terms of what's going on. Now, require was always confusing to me when I first started working with Ruby because I didn't understand the concept of the load path. Once I did, I felt very comfortable using it. All right, we've got about 10 minutes or so left here and 2 more techniques. Let's see if we can get these done. All right, so alias example group 2. Now, this is where we get a little trickier. So I'll admit, if you've followed me so far, you're probably on board with some of these examples that I've put to you at this moment. This is where we are going to go into perhaps the darker arts, or you might think of this as like the more difficult or perhaps more magical way of sort of solving a problem. All right, so what does it mean, alias example group 2? Well, the word describe and the word context are actually just aliases of this thing called the example group. So our spec has this thing called the example group, and it allows you to use the word describe and context interchangeably, well, almost interchangeably within the spec file you create. You notice here, I use a describe first and foremost, got to be on the outside, and this is our describing our recipe. And then within here, I've got the context, which describes different scenarios. This could be described if I want it to be. And what's cool about this actually is that alias example group 2 allows you to come up with whatever names that you might want to use for your, essentially, your example groups. So you're not stuck with describe and context. If you want to come up with your own word for it, you can. And that's what we're going to do in this section. So this is my comment here. Elegance comes when the context is assumed. So we're going to do something else as well when we do this as alias example group. But first, let's start with just creating this alias example group. So imagine here I'm working with my recipe and I'm testing my recipe. What if I wanted to say describe recipe? Perhaps to me, that's more clear in the explanation of what's taking place. And that's something that I say, whenever I'm describing a recipe, I kind of want this to be automatically included, right? Every recipe essentially is going to converge, so why not have it converge? Why do I have to specify all these additional things, right? In this case, they include context. So I'm going to write this, describe recipe, and I'm going to go back here to my terminal, and I'm going to run my test, and everything should blow up magnificently, right? I'm doing what I call the dream-driven development here. I'm saying, hey, I want this to be, does it exist? And it doesn't. And you'll notice it says undefined method, describe recipe right there. So describe recipe does not exist whatsoever, which is great. It just means we have to create it. So I'm going to open up my spec helper file. And inside of here, I'm going to write config alias example group 2. I'm going to give it the name of my example group that I want to define, and I'm going to use a symbol way to represent it. I'm going to say describe recipe. And now I'm going to rerun the test again, and now all of a sudden, magically, describe recipe will work. It's essentially the same thing as describe. So if you want to get a little more colorful, a little more fun with the recipes you describe, you can do that. You can use this daily example group too. However, here's the real power in that I don't want to define this anymore. I wish I could take this out because if I'm describing a recipe, I want you to know, right? If I talk to you for 5 minutes at the beginning like of a stand-up or during the day or when I show you the cookbooks the first time, I want you to know that whenever you describe the recipe, you automatically have a number of things taken care of for you, particularly all these things taken care of in this shared context called include context. And to do that, what we need to do is associate this daily example group 2 to this shared context right here, right? We need to somehow tie them together. And you can do that with our spec by specifying a type. You can say this type right here happens to be, in this case, a recipe. We'll just say converge recipe or recipe. It doesn't matter what name we come up with. The type is really just a tag. And as long as I use the same tag up above as I use below, essentially this shared context will be shared between this. So this will automatically get included. I can simply delete this from my specification. Let me show you this again. I do this daily example group 2, I give it a name, I give it a tag, and then here in the shared context I give it the same tag, and now when I run the test, I should see everything pass, the same as we saw before. It's now just assumed that the context is being included based on the fact that I alias the example group to it. You'll find this in some of the more advanced test suites in terms of like when I was working with Rails. There's a lot of assumptions based on directories and tags and this sort of type that you've seen before. But really what it does is a nice way of cleaning up our specification so that it starts to become very succinct. You know, we're describing a recipe, we're looking at just the node attributes, what installed packages, you know, and these attributes are getting better and better. So our recipe is getting cleaner and cleaner, and perhaps, you know, more elegant. Elegant, again, this could be something that some of you, and I've talked to several people as I delivered this content, and some people say this is a great idea, and some people say, oh my goodness, what's going to happen? Like where am I going to find these examples later? How am I going to teach people? It's up to you to figure out if this is the right sort of path to follow. But I think it's a nice way to sort of assume the context of things and make things look prettier. All right, so here we go. Alias example group 2. Again, it's just an alias for things. We started out with this as the example. We switched it over to describe recipe, and we used or are able to remove the include context as long as we define the alias example group 2 with the describe recipe, and then we essentially specify a type that they share. Great. So here we go, our final one, creating a Ruby gem. So creating a Ruby gem is really the next phase of doing this work. So when working with a Ruby gem, what you want to do is understand like that we need to essentially create a library of our code, right? If we look at the code that we've created so far, we want to move this content out of here and perhaps move it into a different cookbook, because now what would happen is, now that we've got it in the spec helper file, it'll be available in any one of the recipes, the new recipes we define here. But if we had a new cookbook, we wouldn't be able to use this unless we copy and pasted the entire content of the spec helper file. And that doesn't seem like a very good way of managing this code, right? It'd be better if we were able to package it up and deliver it to every one of the workstations that are testing code for our company, for our team and things like that. And that's what we're going to look at with the Ruby gem. So a Ruby gem is very much the same as a chef cookbook. It's really a structured sort of files and folders and a number of specific files with some metadata that describe how it's to be packaged. And all Ruby gems are is that files and folders all zipped up and then sent to, can be sent up to a Ruby gem server, the public one, your own private one, or you don't even need to. You can use it locally and essentially pass something around, on the download to other people, sneakernet if you need to. But really, Ruby gems are really just a way for us to sort of build a reusable component. And it's not as hard as it looks. I'll show you this in this section here. All right. So we're going to use a tool called Bundler. Bundler is very similar to our tool in the chef community called Berkshelf. Berkshelf manages our cookbook dependencies within a cookbook. Bundler does the same thing. And it also happens to have a command that allows us to generate an actual cookbook itself. So you can use bundle by essentially chef exec bundle help. That's going to give you the help. And we're going to walk through actually creating essentially the gem here. All right. So let's get started with creating a gem. right? I'm going to return to my command line here. Return to my command line here, and I'm going to build the gem. So I'm going to move in one directory outside of my cookbook, and I'm going to run chef exec bundle, and I'm going to run bundle. It's going to give me an error because it's going to tell me, hey, I don't know where a gem file is, very similar to Berkshell. I'm going to say bundle gem, and I'm going to give it the name of the gem. And the name of the gem that I'm going to give it is called chefspec-my helpers. This means that chefspec is the core project I'm sort of basing my thing on, and I'm dependent on that project. And then this is my extension on that project. So I'm going to build that. It's going to automatically create essentially a gem structure for me with all the files that I would need. I'm going to open up this project, so chefspec, my helpers. And inside of here, I am going to edit some things very quickly to get things rolling. There's some to-do here, which says summary, write a summary. So my summary is chefspec helpers for testing my cookbooks. And then the description would be a longer version of that. And in some cases, really, you might just make it a little bit longer in terms of like by a period or something like that. At least for our example, that's what I want. I would specify all my different particular license information and other things that need to go with that. This automatically finds the files based on the Git repository and knows what to do in terms of like packaging and all those things up. All right, so that's where we start. That's just a nice way of going. Let me move into my chefspec directory helper too. I'm going to look, yes, I'm already a Git repository. You know, I would actually commit things as I work with it. Now that I've done that, I need to actually move my code inside of there. You'll note that it automatically creates a lib directory for you, a chefspec directory for you, and then inside the chefs directory for you, there's a my helpers, which has your version, and then it's the my helpers here. Normally you're defining Ruby code, but for us, we're not. We're actually just going to take all the code that we defined here inside of this, and I'm just going to move this all into this over here. And I'm going to take out the color example. I'm just going to mostly just, I'm going to take out the color example. I'm going to leave this stuff inside of here. I'm going to assume that RSpec is already loaded and set up that as a dependency eventually inside of the gem spec file, inside of this file. I'd say there's a RSpec dependency, a chefspec dependency, those type of things. But right now, all this code exists right here. And I'm going to essentially build this gem. So let's do the command chef gem build. And then you give it the name of the gem spec file. So here's my gem spec file. It builds the gem, and now I'm going to do chef gem install, and I'm going to specify the name of this file that it actually generated for me. So here it generated me the name of the gem and then the version of the gem, and I'm going to install it. And I can do chef exec gem list, and I'll narrow the scope down to just chef spec, and you'll see that I've got chef spec installed, chefspec my helpers, and then another gem called chefspec OHI. So let's take a look now in our source code. I return back to our project. I can now remove all this code, right? Actually, let me save the color, but remove all this other code, leave the coverage report, and I can say require chefspec, and I believe the name of my project was called my helpers, so my helpers, right? And that's going to look at the path and say chefspec my helpers and load that. I'm going to save it. And now I'm going to run my test as I did before. So I'll return back to the art cookbook, and I'll run chef exec RSpec, and I'll run my test, and everything should pass the same as before, but now all that code is existing inside of a gem. Wonderful. All right, let's do a quick review here. So here you can take a look at another gem that's very similar to the one that I just used here. It's at GitHub, my GitHub account, and it's called chefspec OHI. It's a gem that allows you to test your OHI plugins. So if you're not testing your OHI plugins, take a look at that. But this plugin allows you to, it just takes care of setting up some initial state and context things, similar to what we saw before. So I use bundle gem to create my gem for me. I then specified a summary description, and it didn't complain about a homepage, so I didn't worry about that. I then copied all the content into my lib chefspec myhelpers.rb file, and then I changed into the directory. I built the gem with chef gem build, and then I said chef gem install with the name of the gem file, and it installed it for me. And then I saw that it was present on my system with chef gem list chefspec, and then of course I was able to remove all that code from my spec helper, and I'm now able to port this to anybody's workstation that wants these, right? So now anyone else can use this if they need it. All right, so those are our techniques. So it's a good time now. I'm a little over time, but I appreciate your patience. Let's go into questions at this moment. All right. So questions at this moment. So you're welcome to email me if you have some questions that you want to take offline. Sometimes people have some very particular questions. That would be great to send me an email. If you're watching this after the fact and you want to get in contact with me. If you don't really have a question, but you want to just rate this presentation, please give me a rating down below and leave a comment down below. Let's start working with the questions. So I'm going to move into a new window here, and I'm going to copy the questions I see on my screen onto this right here. Ooh, how much, this is a great question. Here's the first question here that I got. How much of the chef spec stuff is applicable to InSpec? And the thing is, all of it is all applicable. Everything that I did inside of here is possible to be done inside of InSpec, because InSpec as well is built on top of chef spec. So that's something to be aware of. When working with essentially InSpec, you are working with RSpec when you're working with Ruby. So does everything work that way? Well, when you write InSpec, you're not often writing as many examples, but you could, right? And you might not be setting up as much context, but you could. And if you ever do, then you can use every one of the things that I showed you here as well. So you're welcome to use all of the same techniques that you saw here. So I'll say 100%, but you know what I mean? It's really varied, right? Varied based on your needs with InSpec is my thought, right? InSpec, you might not need as much of the work as you do, quite like you do with spec. That's a great question. Thank you very much. All right. This was a question here. Let me turn wrapping on so you can see this. Are the shared examples and context supposed to be in a separate file for reusability? That's a good question. You know, in this example, I take it to the extreme. I move it inside of essentially the spec helper and then move it inside of essentially a gem itself. It doesn't have to be, right? You don't have to actually do these things and move them into separate files. You have to weigh how much of a balance you want to make. Is it clear that I have everything in the same file that I can understand, or is it clear to move everything into these separate files and then sort of assume the context of what's going on? And so you're going to have to figure that out, whether that makes the right sense. For me, if you make the right abstractions, the right choices, moving things out of the way and moving it into another file is the right choice. So for reusability's sake, definitely moving in separate files is the right way to go. But reusability might not be your primary concern. So great question. Thank you very much. All right, let's go to another question here. Chevron is almost the same. Yeah, here we go. Yeah, so this is one of those, again, where it says chevron is almost always the same. If there are several spec files in the cookbook, maybe it's better to put the chevron in some shared place. And as you saw, I did that, right? Like I moved through and I made some changes to the chevron. I extracted just the node attributes portion, put that in its own sort of separate let. And that's the only thing that needs to be different in all of these examples here, right? All these examples here really just became down to what the node attributes are. And I can do the same thing for all this right here. So I can say, well, you know what, let's just make this node attributes, right? Because I don't need the chef run anymore. And then I can delete this and do this. And yeah, the chef run continues to just sort of disappear. Because again, we're converging a recipe. And to me, it seems like this is common. All the time we're converging a recipe. So there's nothing stopping you from defining something like this, you know, just using only describing what you need to describe inside of here. Harder for newer people to sort of get used to, but perhaps more simple for those of us that have like easier to read later. And it's clear to me, like when I read this, I go, when no node attributes are specified, maybe we'd have to change this statement right here. But you know, again, there's a little bit of more refactoring that you would do on this work. Essentially, gives us the thing right that gives us a pretty close idea of how you can sort of remove that the chef run object across all of that. All right. Yeah, another great question. Can you use this, very similar to the InSpec one, can you use this with server spec? And definitely you can. Server spec is also built on top of RSpec, so you can use all the same techniques here, the let, shared context, shared examples, all of that stuff can be used inside of server spec as well. So all these things I showed you while focusing solely on chef spec can work with InSpec and server spec as well. All right, I believe that answers most every question here, so that's great. I think there's one other, what I also want to, and perhaps this person, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by this question here. What I want to also include the shared example in the shared, oh, I do know, okay. What I also want to include the shared examples in the shared context. Yes, so this is how you might do that. So if I come back here, and I come to the spec, well, now it's no longer my spec helper, it's in my gem itself. Would I want to include the shared examples? You could say it behaves like installs packages here. And so you can include the contents of a shared example inside of this. Now when I do that, I need to move this up above because I believe the shared context will be invoked, and then perhaps this will be invoked, and so I think this needs to be up above at least. So it needs to be registered. So yeah, that's how you might do that. Now, would I want that? It depends, right? So this is a naming sort of concern, right? What do I want to do? A converge recipe, does that actually mean install packages? And not every instance is it installing packages, but it may or may not be. You know, it depends on how you want to do it. I want to caution you to say, like, it's very easy to throw everything into the shared context, but you might want to create multiple different contexts or something like that. You know, there's nothing stopping you from creating another context, which is something like I deal with packages, or I install packages, I manage packages, or something like that. Here, in this case, moving it into a converged recipe may be the right thing for you in your environment. It may not be the right thing. Again, the thinking about what's clear and what works right for and what people expect when you're working with those things. So yes, you could do it. Just be aware of, like, when you start combining things, what that means. Are you using the right name for it? And that's where we get into trouble, right, in computer science, the thought of, well, how do we name it correctly? All right. Great. So what I want to, yep, that's it. And then I got another question here. The last one I'll answer is, where should chef spec be used versus inspec and service spec? That's a great question to ask. That's something that, if you're interested, I would encourage you to look at some of the content that I did initially where, let me go way back, go to slide 1 here, what you will learn and who I think you are. These 2 webinars right here, the test-driven development one and this writing great unit test with chef spec one, those will give you some good answers. Or our training that we offer, the test-driven cookbook development, they'll show you the right, or answer the right questions for you. Where's the right location for you to write your unit test, and what's the right location and position for you to write your integration test, or in this case, you know, your inspect or service spec test. So for me, it's really, think about it in this way. When you're working with chef spec is essentially asserting what's inside of the resource collection, and inspec and service spec are asserting what's actually being done, or sort of, you know, the actions being taken on the system. The big difference between, did I build the resource collection right? Did I build all the right resources right? Versus, did it actually work on the real operating system? So there's 2 ways of thinking about, you know, how they're doing their testing. The reason why I like chef spec tests is that I get feedback quicker. I can test complicated logic very easily. Whereas inspec and service spec, that proves, like, does my understanding of how chef works on an operating system, does that work correctly? And those are things that I think are important to test. So a lot of people here at Chef will say, did I write my chef right? That's kind of the chef spec way of doing it. And it's like, does my chef actually work on my operating system, my platform? You know, does that work? And that's the sort of choice you need to make when thinking about whether you should use chef spec or inspec. But again, chef spec, inspec, service spec, they all use these same techniques. So everything we covered today should be usable and help you out as far as getting the work done. All right, so now let me go all the way to the end here. So, creating a Ruby gem. I think I've got to jump a few more slides. Yep, and let's jump the slides to the end. All right, so I believe here we are. We're finishing our questions. Great. All right, and so let's do a little wrap up. So everything that I covered today, links-wise, is available in the attachments that are down below you. So if you look in the bottom left, there should be an attachments tab, a lot of things to click on, and some of you are already happily clicking away on them. Let me just talk about what those are, so that way you have an idea in the event that you need to or want to, you'd like to take a look at what's there. So the slides are there. So the slides that I just used to present this content are available there at this link. So again, just, you know, to copy this link down, just look at the attachments, click on that. If you want the example cookbook that I use as a starting point, you can go there to Elegant Test repo at our chef training organization, and there you can start with that as far as refactoring this. So if this exercise was fun for you, or you'd like to watch this video again and work through it, that's a great place to start. That's the repo that gets you there, gets you started with it. Here are all the RSpec resources. So let, shared examples, shared context, and then alias example group 2. You'll find that most every one of these are linking you to the Relish app website, which is their documentation website that they use for when they export their builds. So this automatically happens. They've got a continuous integration or continuous sort of documentation deployment. So a CDD, continuous documentation deploy that happens. So any releases of RSpec can be found here and the details about them. Their documentation, these are direct links to them. You might want to search around if you're interested in other things that are possible inside of RSpec. And then, of course, I use 2 Ruby resources, the first one being Require and then the second one being a Ruby gem. Those can be a little tricky to understand, so it's good to have the documentation to take a look at them. Ruby's Require, of course, like I said, looks very similar to Path and other things like that that you're used to inside of operating systems. Take a look at that documentation. That's straight to the Ruby docs, and that's the kernel method that it's or sort of kernel module that Require essentially is present on and is present within every one of essentially all Ruby classes, unless they do something crazy, of course. And then finally, here we have the Ruby Gems link. That will get you in creating Ruby Gems. Finally, I encourage you, if you're interested in learning more, taking your education further, on YouTube, we've posted my Chef Comp workshop, Advanced Dungeons and Testing Dragons. This contains a lot of the content you saw here, and then I take it further as we develop custom resource cookbooks that we develop with our test with fixture cookbooks and some other advanced techniques. Some stubbing, some mocking, and some other things that really push your boundaries in terms of like your RSpec knowledge. So I encourage you to check out that series of videos. I'm wearing a gnome costume. It's a lot of fun. And I want to say thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate it. Have a wonderful day. Keep learning.